This week, 40% of major companies admitted something quietly. They deployed AI agents that they can't control, can't explain, and can't stop. No oversight, no visibility into what they're actually doing. Shadow autonomy. And that same vulnerability is happening in your personal life right now. You're following systems to make decisions, using human design charts to tell you who you are, outsourcing your knowing to influencers or algorithms, all while the actual infrastructure keeps these systems running is operating in complete darkness. That's the crisis nobody's naming yet. I'm Mark Roach. This is Transcendent. I've spent decades inside systems watching how they work: oil, finance, corporate architecture. And now across my work with thousands of people navigating consciousness evolution, I'm noticing something critical. The geopolitical instability we're watching isn't directly connected to a collapse in personal authority. Geopolitical instability we're watching is directly connected to a collapse in personal authority. Most people have never learned to trust their own knowing. And that vulnerability is being exploited at exactly the moment when understanding your own architecture could actually set you free. By the end of this, I hope you'll understand three things. First, why the geopolitical chaos you're watching is directly connected to a crisis in individual authority. Second, how human design, properly understood, becomes a map for reclaiming your authority instead of outsourcing it to someone else's interpretation. And third, what it actually means to build a life around your design rather than performing a design you got from a consultant. This comes from decades of watching how systems work, from my own journey out of the frameworks that didn't fit, and from standing with thousands of people at the exact moment they realize they've been seeking permission from people who have no actual authority to grant it. Well, let me start with what's actually happening geopolitically, because it's even more intimate than the news makes it sound. The World Economic Forum just ranked geo-economic confrontation as the #1 global risk for 2026. Not military conflict, not climate catastrophe, geo-economic confrontation. What does that mean? It means nations, companies, and individuals are all competing for control of the same thing: information flow, decision-making authority. Who gets to say what's true? The US and China are right now in a confrontation about who controls critical minerals, semiconductors, and decision-making infrastructure. Well, the reason? Centralized authority. Well, it's collapsing everywhere simultaneously. You watch governments and institutions scrambling to maintain control that they no longer have. But here's what's been missed. Every person who outsources their personal decision-making to a system is actually strengthening the very infrastructure that's destabilizing geopolitically. When you can't trust your own knowing, you become dependent. When you become dependent, you give your power to whoever claims to have the answers. And right now, the people claiming to have the answers are the same ones who are building autonomous systems they can't control. This is where it gets personal. That geopolitical fight, it's happening because centralized authorities have lost their capacity to lead in a world that's moving at a speed of consciousness and information. Command and control doesn't work anymore, but instead of admitting that, institutions keep tightening their grip. And in that grip, people are suffocating. So they reach for anything that claims to have clarity, a system, a framework, a human design reading that finally explains why they don't fit into conventional boxes. I watched this in oil companies. The geologist understood the earth. The corporate structure told them what the earth meant, how to extract value, what the costs actually were. Those geologists who stayed sane were the ones who trusted their own knowing more than they trusted the institution's narrative. Well, the ones who fragmented were the ones who kept trying to make or force the institutional story true inside their own nervous system, and they split themselves in half. And eventually, you can't live that way. I'm watching the same dynamic unfold across consciousness communities right now. People study human design, and it's genuinely useful as a map. But then they start living inside someone else's interpretation of their design instead of using it as a framework to understand their own direct experience. They get a reading from a consultant and treat it like a gospel. They memorize their chart, perform it like an identity rather than as understanding it as architecture or framework. And here's what's trending right now that nobody's talking about. Human design itself is becoming the new AI agent. People are outsourcing their interpretation of their chart to consultants while using their design as a wall instead of a window or a gateway to understand themselves. The chart is supposed to be a mirror. Instead, it's becoming a cage. And the people most enthusiastically caging themselves are the ones who finally found language for why conventional systems didn't or don't work. And they're escaping one trap and walking directly into another. And there's the fundamental difference between knowing your design and living your design. Real human design, that work, well, it works like this. You learn the framework, some distance, and you watch your own life. You notice where the framework illuminates actual patterns in how you move through the world. You notice, you adjust, you test, you get feedback, you stay in dialogue with your own experience. You don't force, you don't resist. You experiment. But you use this experiment as permission to understand yourself, to give yourself room to break these old conditioned patterns and feel more deeply. This isn't permission to stop thinking or being responsible in your life. Now, most human design works like this instead. You get a reading and you believe a consultant more than you believe yourself, and you perform the design like an actor would. You use it as permission or maybe as an excuse to do things that you never gave yourself permission to do, that are in this design that you've learned or heard, but you're not even checking it with yourself. And you become dependent on that reading or on that system to tell you what to do next. When you outsource your authority to a system, you've essentially replicated the same problem geopolitically that nations are facing today. You created a centralized authority that you depend on. And like all centralized authorities, it will eventually fail you because it doesn't have access to your actual lived experience. Your relationship with your God and the universe and the spirit. A manifesting generator doesn't thrive by waiting passively. They thrive by moving proactively to put themselves in position to recognize opportunities. A projector doesn't succeed by hiding, they succeed by making themselves visible so they can be invited to whatever they're actually qualified to guide, where they're competent. A generator doesn't force, but they don't freeze either. They test, they listen, they stay engaged, they move. A manifester doesn't ask permission, but they also don't ignore how other people feel and how their actions affect the system around them. In every case, the real work is integrating the design with the actual intelligence and knowing and sensing that you have access to from inside your life. The design is information, it's not destiny. But what we've been trained to treat systems like as destiny is, that's because it's easier than taking responsibility of actually knowing yourself or ourselves. Here's what's breaking down right now that changes everything. 74% of new web content is AI-generated elements, deepfake voices, synthetic identities, AI-generated personas. Human trust signals are breaking down everywhere. People can't tell what's real anymore. And the terrifying part of this is this. In that vacuum, the people you trust are the ones claiming certainty, the ones with the answers, the ones who can tell you exactly who you are and what you should do. But the ones who actually have authority are the ones willing to admit, I don't know, uncertainty, and trust you to figure it out alongside them. We're watching a massive shift right now happen in real time. Authentic human-made content is commanding 60% value premium over AI-generated content. Why? Because people are so exhausted by the polished perfection that proves nobody made it as real. They're hungry for evidence that an actual human being with uncertainty and edges and real thinking and flaws created something. That's what the entire moment is about right now. It's not finding the perfect system. It's about finding someone real enough to admit they don't know while standing firmly in their life and doing what they do. The geopolitical implications of this are massive. When millions of people stop outsourcing their authority and start building networks based on direct knowing, everything changes. Institutions lose their power not because they're attacked, but because they're abandoned. People stop seeking permission from systems that don't actually serve them. Communities reorganize around what actually works instead of what the institutions say should work. This is already happening. You're watching it unfold at scale. The vulnerability in this moment, and this is critical, is that new centralized authorities are trying to emerge. Influencers, gurus, systems. They're offering a more modern version of the same bargain. Let us tell you who you are in language that feels more authentic, more conscious, more real. And because people are so hungry to be seen and understood, they're falling for it again. They're just doing it in a more spiritual feeling framework instead of an institutional one. What actually liberates you is learning to hold your own knowing with confidence, not arrogance, not bypassing the wisdom available to you in systems and frameworks that other people's insights, but actually integrating them with what you sense directly about how you're built, how you move, what works for you. This is what authority actually means. It's not power over others. It's clarity about yourself. I watched someone recently describe their human design, and they said, I'm a manifesting generator with a defined sacral center and no head center, which means I don't think my way into decisions, I feel my way. And then they said something that broke my heart and really informed everything. But I've been trained to override my whole life. I've been trained to override that feeling, that way of operating. I've been trained against that my whole life. I've been told that thinking is more reliable than feeling. So even though I have this design, I don't trust it. Well, that's a confession. And that's the work. It's not about learning your design. It's learning to trust the knowing that your design names and validates. The design is just language. Your architecture is what's been running beneath or underneath the whole time of your life. You've just been trained not to trust it. In geopolitics, what's happening is that nations built on centralized thinking are facing systems that require distributed intelligence. You can't command and control a world that's moving at the speed of consciousness and information. You have to build networks of people who know what they know and can move with integrity. The ones doing it successfully aren't the ones clinging hardest to hierarchy. They're the ones distributing authority to people who can actually think and work competently with integrity. The same is true for you individually. Stop waiting for someone to validate your design, interpret your chart, tell you what your patterns mean. Learn the frameworks, learn yourself. There's a profound difference. One makes you dependent and one makes you free. The gap between false promises and real authority isn't about finding the right system. It's about learning to trust what you've known all along, how you actually move, what actually works for you, what your intelligence is telling you beneath all the conditioning. Human design is useful when it points you back to yourself. It's dangerous when it replaces yourself. And in a world reorganizing around authority at every scale, that distinction isn't academic, it's essential. That is the work that I do with people who've hit the ceiling of every system that they've tried, not because they're broken, but because they finally got smart enough to recognize the cage. If you're recognizing that your current path doesn't align with your actual authority, not what someone told you your authority should be, but what you actually know about how you move through the world, let's work together on a strategy. Book a session. We'll spend focused time on what actually looks like to make decisions from inside yourself instead of from outside your chart or outside some institution's requirement. The first step is admitting you don't need a new system. You need clarity about yourself. I'm Mark Roach. This is Transcendent. Wishing you all the best. The authority you're seeking has been inside you. You've just been trained not to recognize it as legitimate.